Please do realize that this is about opening buildings. We have a separate Zoom scheduled for Thursday on worship services. Okay, so obviously they go together. They may or may not. There's going to be different questions perhaps and different information, but we knew that there was a lot of information to share and a lot of information you might want to share with each other. So we wanted to make sure that we covered everything with all of you that we can. Now, if you would, please open your hearts to God's word and God's prayer with me this morning. Let us pray together. Gracious God, we come together, all of us, in this new, wonderful way. We bring you thanks. We bring you thanks first and foremost for this beautiful day as we wake up and settle down for our day in front of our laptops and computers and iPhones. Please remind us to safely venture outside and enjoy your creation together, apart, however we can safely do that. God, today we hold in prayer all who have been affected by this COVID virus, as we have every day for seemingly so long. All who are affected by grief, all those who are affected by unemployment, by food insecurity. God, all of your people who have been deeply touched by the ravages of COVID-19 in our area. And God, we also remember to all of those who are affected by the systemic racism all around us. And by that, God, I mean people who are affected directly, and all of us who are affected by this second plague. Help us to walk your path. Help us to walk your path of equity, of inclusion, and love for everyone. Walk with us today, God. Be with us as we discern the best way forward to open up our buildings, not in our time, but God, in your time. Putting the health and the safety of your people first and foremost as we make these challenging decisions. And God, we ask all this in the name of your Son, the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, good morning again, friends. Thank you for coming on to our Zoom. I have a couple quick announcements and then we'll hand it over to Susan and get up and running. We do have several Zooms scheduled for this week. Yesterday, there was a Zoom that took place around daycare centers and preschools. If you missed it, it is actually uploading right now, and we will have a link for you on the Presbytery website by the end of the day. Tomorrow we have our Clergy in Pulpits Zoom gathering, which we've had since mid-March on every Wednesday, and that continues. And on Thursday, as I mentioned earlier, we will have another informational Zoom gathering on returning to care-filled worship services. So you may be interested in that. And on Friday, we continue with our spiritual practices Zoom gathering. All of these are at 10 o'clock. I wanted to remind you that in recognition of these very stressful times, particularly for pastors and other leaders who are in the Board of Pensions program, that the Employee Assistance Program offers free sessions, 10 free sessions, which may be very helpful for you to take advantage of. Additionally, for pastors and other leaders, Hudson River Presbytery is offering 6 free coaching sessions as we move forward together during these times. All of that information is also on the website. And finally, June 19th begins a historic event. which is the PCUSA General Assembly virtual meeting. This is going to be of much interest to all of us. It begins on Friday evening. Everyone is welcome. The live stream information is available on the Presbytery website, or you can just Google it. Please make some time to join on Friday evening if you would like to watch together the election of the new moderators of PCUSA. And then again, it continues on the 26th and the 27th, the following Friday and Saturday, the business of the Presbyterian Church. I think you'd find it interesting and fascinating. So do try to join us, particularly for the opening worship. I think that's something that is truly something to behold and participate in. So with that, Susan, tell us about opening our buildings and
okay. Let me see if I can get my screen share. The first thing you need to know, just as by way of background, is that this is being recorded. That means that any questions you ask will be recorded. Anything you put in the chat will be recorded. So just as you're aware of that. Basically what we're, assuming I can, basically, can everybody see the screen? If you can't see the screen, that's what you should be looking at now. As Deb said, what we're discussing today are the issues connected with reopening your church's campus. And by that, I mean including parking lots, etc., not just the building. If you have other pieces to your campus. On Thursday, we will be focusing on what should and shouldn't happen in worship under New York State laws. So that will be where we'll be discussing preaching and music and all those kinds of things in more detail on the Zoom on Thursday. If you're looking for a written format of this information, if you go to our Presbytery website, you will see a guide that I've been putting together. I updated it yesterday, called When New York Forward Makes a Return to Public Worship Possible. And there it actually goes through all of the steps of New York State, and also at the same time covers other material that's been suggested to consider as you think through these issues. And it's a pretty helpful list of resources, I think, at the back. So if you're looking for the, as I refer to things like the New York State template, you'll find a link to it there. If you're looking for the guidelines that New York State has put together for reopening New York, guidelines for religious and funeral services, you'll find it there. The important thing is, as we go through the material today, is this is what's the law at the moment. I have updated the guide, I think, 7 times now at this point, because New York keeps adding requirements. And so as you open, keep checking it, because there may be new requirements that come along. So we are allowed, beginning June 9th, we are allowed to go back to worship in our buildings under certain conditions. So beginning this past week, for any religious or funeral service that's occurring indoors, the requirement is that you limit your congregation, your attendees, to no more than 25% of the maximum occupancy of the building. So if your sanctuary is maximum occupancy of 400, you can have 100 people in your sanctuary, right? That's the requirement now. So 25% of your maximum occupancy. For some of our congregations that are smaller but have large campuses and large buildings, that won't be an issue. For others, it will be a big deal to fit people in. If the church campus has separate buildings available for use, you can put multiple groups in the building, in separate parts of the building, as long as they are using separate entrances and exits, and as long as the group doesn't interact with the other group. So one group, for instance, could be in your fellowship hall, and another group could be in your sanctuary at the same time, up to 25% capacity, maximum capacity of each of those, as long as they're coming in and out of separate entrances along the way. And you will find the requirements that I'm referring to are spelled out on this guide, Reopening New York, Guidelines for Religious and Funeral Services. The link is there. Again, it's in the document on our website as well. And it is what I'm going to be going through today, these requirements. I'm going to share them with you. Some of them personally I think are wonderful. Some of them I'm not sure why New York has chosen, but they are the requirements for reopening. And so you need to be aware of them. The other thing to say is this reopening is explicitly for religious services, not for all activities in a church building. New York Forward has seemed to indicate that the full use of our church campus will be considered when we hit phase 4. We are currently in phase 2. So we're not talking about reopening your campus for all the different types of activities. They've given us permission to reopen for worship. Other than that, right now in phase 2, you can only have activities in your building that are limited to 10 people or less, right? That's the general rule in phase 2. When we hit phase 3, it will be 25 people or less. It does not mean you can open your building to your Zumba group if it's not going to be, or to your I don't know what you have in your building, but to a gathering of friends coming together to talk about gardening. You can't do that under these requirements. This is only for worship at the moment, worship and funerals. So New York requires that for all of our congregations, before they open, you have a plan in place. And it's pretty specific on the types of things that have to be in place. These are the same categories that are for any organization, whether you're a business or a not-for-profit. You must have this plan in place before you reopen. Who's responsible for the plan? The session, not the pastor, all right? You can do this through your entire session, or you can have your session designate a team to do it, but ultimately the session has to sign off on it. All right? It's also the session that's responsible for implementing and enforcing the plan, not the pastor. That's not your pastor's job description. That's the session's job description. New York State requires that that plan be conspicuously posted in your building or buildings. If you have more than one, it needs to be in each of them. So I'm going to go through the different categories in the plan, but you need to make sure before you open your building that this plan is in place. The easiest way probably to do that is to use the template that New York Forward has given us. Some of it will not apply quite as easily to congregations, but most of it will. And you can just fill in the blanks on that template for each of the categories. You can add there's at the very end, there's a place for other things that you need to put down. And as I was saying on the call for nursery schools and childcare centers yesterday, if you're running either of those, you probably want to fill those other things in the end of the template where there's the blank for other categories. Among the things that you must cover in this plan is how you're going to keep social distancing when you're doing worship, how you're going to provide protective equipment for everybody who's in your building, how you're going to clean and disinfect your building, how you're going to communicate with those using the space, and how you're going to do health screenings for people who are using your campus. Each of these are requirements. The other thing that you need to do as you think through this plan is to check with your own personal insurance carrier on your building to see if they have additional requirements. Most of them don't, but a few do. And so you need to say, is there anything specific that you're requiring of us as we make our plan? So the size of the gathering that can be in your building first, under the current New York requirements. Again, it's limited to 25% of the maximum occupancy of a building. All right. The plan has to include how you're going to manage the number of people in a service. So if 25% for you is 100 people, what happens when 101 comes? What's your contingency plan for overflow? You must spell that out. Are you going to have alternate options? Are you going to have outdoor services if it's too too many people? Are you going to have drive-in services? Are you going to do multiple services? Also, are you going to continue to do, or are you going to add, if you're not yet doing, remote virtual services? All of those should be outlined in your plan if that's part of what you're going to do if you have more than 25% of your maximum occupancy. So the size of the gathering is the first thing that you need to cover. The second thing that needs to be covered is around social distancing. And here, social distancing, New York State says, number one, for your staff, the only staff that should be in your buildings under this new requirement are staff that are absolutely necessary. This includes both employees and volunteers. So this is not a, okay, open your door and go back to whoever was in your church before quarantine time yet. This is who needs to absolutely be in your building. Everybody else should still be working from home. And this is true on Sunday as well. When you're doing this, only people who must be there if you're opening your building for a Sunday worship are the ones that are there. Your volunteers should be kept to the minimum necessary. With few exceptions, and the exceptions would be things like if you have pallbearers at a funeral that's happening in your building, the pallbearers can't be 6 feet apart. But with those very few exceptions, everybody must keep a distance of at least 6 feet between every individual in the building at all times. Okay? That includes then on Sunday morning modifying your seatings in the pews, if you have pews, or your chairs. So individuals are 6 feet apart. In your offices, you must have at least 6 feet apart. If currently your office configuration does not have that, you need to make sure that there's a way that that is being enforced, so only one person is in the office space at a time, so that there's not, people are not closer than 6 feet. Singing activity. And we will spend more time on this on Thursday, but singing activities in a building must have at least 12 feet of distance between individuals. And there are other protective measures that the law also requires. In general, the law and basically every other article that I've seen that has come out says singing should be limited or avoided completely. But if you're going to do it, the minimal thing is 12 feet. They suggest partitions between singers and a whole series of other protective measures as well as the 12 feet.
Susan, can I interrupt you for just a second,
Sure.
please? Just a couple
Sure.
questions so we don't get too far adrift here. The restrictions on outdoor, are you going to cover that, or does that still remain what it was before?
It's basically what it was before. So if, for instance, you're doing drive-in worship, you should be keeping 6 feet between cars if windows are going to be open. If you're doing worship outside, 6 feet between people, people should be masked, etc. So those are the same things as for any other sort of gathering outside.
And another question is around family units. So
family units may sit together. So in a sanctuary, for instance, the 6 feet rule would be between family units. All right. That becomes a little harder when you're trying to figure out space because you don't know who's coming in and who's coming out as a family unit. And so it makes more sense to try to figure out how many people can I fit in my sanctuary if I'm doing 6 feet among between each person. And then if family units choose to sit together, that's a little easier. But cordoning off alternate pews and so forth so that you have the 6 feet would be a starting point on that.
Okay.
Anything else, Deb?
Not right now. Thank you.
Okay, sure. You need to, in your sanctuaries and in your buildings, whatever buildings are going to be open, post signs of traffic directions. So you may, if you have outer aisles and a center aisle in your sanctuary, for instance, people may walk in the center aisle and walk out the outer aisles. If you have hallways, which way do people walk in and out? In pews, which way do they enter? All of that is to reduce bi-directional foot traffic. And the state is actually indicating that you need to actually have those signs visible where people are walking. This is not just tell people ahead of time. There must be signs throughout the building showing the traffic direction. You also need to put down social distancing markers in commonly used areas. So if, for instance, people are going to be coming down through a door, all right, into the sanctuary, you need to space out. You see this, for instance, if you've gone to a post office now. Post offices have put up spacing, so people are standing 6 feet apart. You need to do the same thing in any area where people may be waiting to come in or out of a building, is to put those same kind of social distancing markers on your floors or indicated by signs on your walls. You need to make clear to people that all physical contact is not allowed during an activity, service, event, all right? That includes hugs, shaking hands, any kind of physical contact that could be there. You are required to make clear to the people attending in your building that that's not to happen. You should be propping or holding doors open during peak periods when people enter and exit the facilities so that they do not have to touch those doors. And you are being asked to provide for a flow of fresh outside air throughout the building during this, because that will help if somebody ends up being contagious, that will help the air circulating rather than keeping the contagion in the building. Air conditioners are a highly debatable thing at the moment. Whether if they have the proper filters, people are saying they're fine. If they don't have the proper filters, a lot of the studies are showing they will just make the circulation of the virus worse if you're using them. So they're pushing outside air however you can make that flow happen.
Susan, we lost your audio.
You can't hear me at all?
No, we lost you.
I can hear.
I can hear.
I'm
hear.
not showing my, okay.
I can hear you.
Is it just
fine.
me? Everybody else can hear? Go right ahead.
Yeah.
It's just me.
I can
Okay,
hear.
go right ahead.
So you need to encourage people to leave the building rather than mingling after a service. And you need to have a procedure by which they safely do this. So if people are leaving and going out to your parking lot or to the street to get into cars, they need to leave with 6 feet in between as they leave. And it's your obligation to figure out how to do that for them. Obviously no fellowship hours after worship, because that would allow people to mingle, and that's frowned upon at the moment because it risks health issues by doing it. You are being asked to limit the touching of pulpits, podiums, seating, doors, railings, and other shared surfaces, all right, as well as shared objects. So Bibles, hymnals, collection plates, that's limit the touching, or require people when they're in your building and going near any of those things to wear gloves when in contact with the surface and object, or require people to sanitize their hands before and after contact with the object. Otherwise, each time the object is used, the object has to be disinfected. I watched a video of one of our congregations that was back at worship this past Sunday, and one person went up and used the pulpit mic and touched it. And then the next person went up and used the pulpit mic and adjusted it for them. And New York State is saying that's a bad idea. They're actually saying it's illegal. You can't do that. You either people have gloves on, or they sanitize their hand just before they do it and then again right after, or you have to not be touching those things, all right? The easiest thing, if possible, is to, and they're suggesting it actually, there's a column that is in the Reopening New York recommended best practices. You remove the objects that are mainly problems. So things like Bibles, hymnals, collection plates should be taken out of the sanctuary because one person could touch them and then somebody else could touch them. And that's easier than requiring the other sanitizing of hands and so forth. You should prohibit the use of tightly common spaces. If you have elevators, for instance, or if people are driving together in cars, for us, probably elevators are more the occasion, or small rooms, they need to be prohibited. If somebody's going to use an elevator, all the people in the elevator have to wear face coverings. The space has to be quickly cleaned after they've used it. And if more than one person uses it, the occupancy is a maximum of 50% of maximum capacity. So if you have somebody who needs an elevator to get into your building, you're going to have to provide for a way for it to be cleaned after it's used, so that other people who have to use it can be kept safe. If restrooms are being used, you have to ensure proper social distancing in the restrooms. This probably means blocking off, if you have stalls in your restrooms, blocking off some of the stalls. Because in most restrooms that have several stalls, they're right next to each other, right? One after another. That would not be 6 feet away from each other. So you need to find a way to close some of the stalls in the restrooms. And you need to make sure that people don't stand outside individual stalls, but that they wait outside the restroom so that there's not too many people in a restroom, and that they be spaced while they're waiting. You also need to designate areas for pickups of people and objects, drop-offs of objects or people, and delivery. You must specify in your plan how that's happening. So that's the second category. The third category we need to look at is protective equipment. Personal protective equipment, and here we're talking about face coverings, possibly gloves if you're going to be touching things, must be worn at all times by all persons in the building, except when seated at least 6 feet from another person. That means in order for that to happen, you have to provide that personal protective equipment if somebody does not come with it. And all personal protective equipment must be cleaned or replaced after it's used and may not be shared. So again, this obligation falls on you as the building's owners to do this, not the person. If you have tenants, if you have other worshiping communities in there, they're not the ones who are responsible for coming up with the face coverings, for instance. You are. Right? You have to make sure that each of the people using your building for worship is trained on how to wear, if they're going to have to clean, and discard the face coverings, etc. along the way. Here's one that clergy may not like, but it is listed as a must in New York state laws. If robes or other garments are worn in a building, once worship is open, I know when I've watched virtual worship services, a lot of our clergy are wearing the robes in the building, but they're in the building by themselves. Now, once you're in the building with other people, if a robe or other garment, and here we're talking about choir robes or clergy robes as examples, are worn in a building, they must be cleaned and laundered between usages. It's even if there's a week in between, they must be, New York requires that they be cleaned and laundered before you bring them back into the building. And then finally, baptismal fonts. Deb, question? Okay. Baptismal fonts.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Hello? Okay. Baptismal fonts or other shared water-related services should be empty. Nothing should be allowed to keep water in it in your sanctuary. And this goes from everything from vases for flowers to the baptismal font. I know a lot of our sanctuaries leave water in their baptismal fonts. At this time, that should not be happening. So those are requirements around protective equipment. The next area that we're required to have plans for is cleaning and disinfecting. And here, you're supposed to practice the increased risk reduction cleaning and disinfecting measures using CDC and New York Department of Health guidance. You will, again, in the guide that's on the Presbytery webpage, you will find links for those. The easiest thing to start with is to remove any non-essential item from common spaces so that it doesn't have to be cleaned and disinfected. If, for instance, you have some of our congregations have toys in one section of the sanctuary for children. If a family is sitting with children there, any toy that's used must be cleaned and disinfected between worship services or between children, if more than one child is using it, as an example. So it's easier to take things out. Bibles, hymnals, easier to remove them than to have to clean them and disinfect them. You are required to post and encourage proper hand hygiene, including when using any area or equipment that might be touched by others. So you have to install hand sanitizer dispensers, touchless ideally, if you can find them when possible, at entrances and at contact areas such as meeting rooms and lobbies. No shared food or beverages are allowed in worship. We will talk on Thursday a little bit about communion. So if that's going to come up when you see this, take that off the plate for right now. But no other shared food or beverages are allowed. You need to clean and disinfect your restroom surfaces, fixtures, switches at least once a day, more frequently if you have high traffic usage. All right. While you're whoever's doing the cleaning and disinfecting, you need to make sure that that person is wearing masks and gloves at all times when they're doing it. And you always need to clean a surface prior to disinfecting it. It's a two-step process that New York is asking for. The first step is to clean the surface completely, to remove any germs, any dirt that's there. After that, then you should use a list from the disinfectant products approved for use against COVID-19, again on the list at the end of the guide for doing the disinfecting. So you're asking your cleaning people, whoever that is, to do the two steps in each surface that has been used by people. If you have a confirmed COVID case on your campus, individuals need to be trained to use products that will disinfect all the surfaces throughout the area that the person who has had the COVID has been in. The next area that the New York Forward Plan asks us to have a plan for is around communications. First part I've talked a little bit about. You have to post signage throughout the campus to remind individuals of proper hygiene, social distancing, the use of protective equipment like masks and cleaning, disinfecting protocols. You have to have as well a communication plan to prepare people who are using your building. That's the congregation and any other group. If you have other groups worshiping there, them as well, or if you have groups of under 10 worshiping, to what to expect when returning to the building. That has to be gotten out to people ahead of time. Before people come onto your campus, you must provide clear information to them about whether or how you will provide for restrooms, for changing rooms for people with young children, for families with small children in general and what they're going to do, and for people with special needs, because they may all be affected based on these rules. So you must spell out that information. And so you use web pages, text and email groups, social media campaigns appropriately so people are not surprised when they return to your campus. People are looking forward when they come back to a campus to coming back to the familiar. And if you think about these rules, before we even get to the screening, that's the last step that's being required. This is not going to be the familiar in almost any way. They're going to have to walk in differently. They're going to have to sit differently. They'll be responding to the worship services differently. They will be using restrooms differently and interacting with each other differently. You need to help people know that so they're not taken off guard when they walk onto your campus. So screening. You are required as the owner of your building to implement mandatory health screening assessments for employees, for faith leaders, and for volunteers. That's ushers, people who are working in your buildings in any other ways, people who are helping with the services. And you must do minimally, you must do temperature check and ask, have you been exposed to COVID-19 symptoms in the past 14 days? Have you had a positive COVID test in the past 14 days? Have you had a close contact with somebody who is suspected of having COVID in the past 14 days? Every day that somebody comes onto your campus who is on one of those categories, you must ask those questions and do that check, and you must document it. So somebody on your campus has to be charged with asking those questions and keeping a record that you have asked those questions.
Susan, I'm going to interrupt here and ask some questions.
Sure.
We have some questions
Sure.
from the chat. Specifically, can you clarify baptism?
We'll do baptism on Thursday. It's part of worship, so.
Also, okay, thank you. There's a question about bulletins and how to distribute, how and if it's appropriate to distribute bulletins.
Again, we'll cover it on Thursday, but the answer is the preference is to not hand out bulletins. To not be doing that. Ask people to pull bulletins up on their phones if they want them in front of them, or put them on screens up on the wall of the sanctuary, or do without them. We will see on Thursday that the recommendation is also not to do unison prayers together out loud and so forth. And so bulletins will play a very different role than they've played in the past. If we're not singing hymns and we're not reading prayers together, and bulletins become very different. And we'll talk about it more on Thursday.
Thank you. Is there a place to get signage, the signage that you spoke about?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
There may be people who are doing this for a business now. I don't know the answer.
And the last question, if a pastor goes to the church daily to check phone messages, they have to record taking temperatures?
Once you have opened your building, the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Right now we have buildings that are closed and pastors who are going in periodically to pick up things from their office or to check messages. That's one person in a building by themselves. That's not a problem. Once you have your pastor and your secretary, or your pastor and your choir director, then you've gone to a whole different thing. And then the answer is yes, your building is now open to some extent. If they're both in the building at the same time, then you must begin to keep logs and do this check.
Who takes the temperatures? Or you take your own?
Your session needs to make a plan for how that happens. We're going to see, let me put the last, you're also to encourage attendees to complete the screening. So that would include the same questions and the same temperature check. You're to encourage them. You can't require attendees to do this, but you're to encourage them to do it. So it's a larger question than who's taking the temperature or asking, have you been exposed to COVID-19 in the last 14 days of a pastor and the office manager. We're now talking about how do you do this as well for people coming into the building for worship. And they can say, I won't answer your questions, but you're encouraged to ask them.
Thank you.
I have a question.
On this?
Well, it's kind of related. Earlier, you talked about no air conditioners. I would assume that overhead fans would be prohibited as well as air conditioners.
It depends. We'll come back to it, but it depends. I want to finish screening, but it depends what the fans are doing, I would suppose. If it's blowing air out, not blowing things from one person to another, probably they'd be a good thing. If they're making a flow, it probably would be a good thing. The other thing that you need to be aware of is you need to coordinate screening to prevent people from intermingling in close contact with each other while you're doing the screening. So you notice it said encourage attendees to be screened. you need to have people spaced out as you're doing it, over 6 feet from each other. You don't want them gathering while you're doing the screening, right? Because that will be a problem. And those doing the screening need to wear appropriate protective equipment. So that includes, for screenings, a mask, a face mask, and gloves minimally, all right? And then you need to have a process for what happens if you get yes answers or a temperature. If somebody is running a temperature of 102, when you check them, what do? All right. How do you nicely say, sorry, you can't come into worship. We want you to go home. Here's who you contact, which is what New York is asking us to do, to send them home with instructions to contact their health providers for assessment and testing. So you need all of those steps in effect. And so now we're going to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. It's a lot of material, and I would urge you, as you think through it, to, number one, think through a couple of key questions as you think through all these steps. Are your members ready to reopen? Do they really, are they going to come back? And do they feel ready at this point to step back into the building, given all these things? Are your staff and volunteers trained to do the steps that are now going to be required, right? Is the facility ready to meet the requirements? Do you have the hand sanitizers in the place? Do you have the signage in the place? And then are you able to monitor and put in place all of the various requirements? And you have to keep monitoring, because these are the requirements now. As New York has experiences with groups being larger, they will change. So do you have that in place as well? So questions?
Susan, I was the temperature screening mandatory for you were talking about in relation to people who are working at the church, and I wasn't sure if it was mandatory for those coming into a church to a worship service.
You know, it's encouraged, but not mandatory. For
Okay,
all the questions, the screening questions, etc., are encouraged to have for people coming in, or for a Bible study or other small group, are encouraged, but they're not required. For volunteers, for employees, they are required. And I've listed pastors separately because pastors are sometimes considered employees and sometimes not considered employees. It's required for the pastor as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Caroline Jicery, and I'm from the Peekskill Presbyterian Church. And my question, this is a lot of information to absorb. Will this document be shared on your website so we could download it and
Yes.
we have time to discuss this within the session and with our task force that is assigned to transition the church back into service?
Yes, so first of all, there's a guide. It looks, oh, you're not gonna be able to see it because I have a virtual screen, but there's a guide that's actually already a written guide that's already,
Okay.
There we go. Betsy is holding it up, if you can see Betsy. Betsy, say something so you can keep
Sorry.
go to your screen and hold it up.
Hi.
All right, so
Okay,
there's this
gotcha.
guide.
Says
It's on the
there-
website.
It's the New York Forward thing. Oh, I'm bad at this. And then
No,
it has
I can see
pretty
it, thank you.
picture. Okay.
Right,
So
okay.
you should download that. It's on the main page of the website. The most recent one of those is June 14th. So make sure you have the most updated one. I
Right.
put the date on the bottom. Download that. That's the written one. This video will also be put on the website, so you can go through the PowerPoint video and the comments that went with it.
Okay,
so you'll
great.
have
Thank
both
you so
of them.
much. Thank you.
I have a question. On the
Yes.
temperatures, is it mandated that a person actually take the temperatures? Or can the people take the temperatures before they come that day? Because unless you have, what kind of thermometer are you going to have? Or do we have to go out and buy a new thermometer to do this?
Right. So it does not spell out how you have to make sure that people have taken their temperature. So whether you could say to your employees, I need you to take your temperature at home before you come and tell me that your temperature is 98.9 today and tomorrow it's 99.1, you know, or whether you're going to do it there, that's not spelled out.
Is the kind of documentation needed spelled out? Is there a certain form we would have to
It's
fill out?
not. It says to document it. And the lawyer in me wants to say that, you know, once you document something, I'm looking, where did Ellen go? She was on the screen somewhere. So I have a different lawyer in front of me. So the lawyer in me wants to say, once you've documented something, the more documentation you have, the more problems in some ways you could also have. So I would make lean documentation that, yes, I've asked that they've taken their temperature, it was this, and I've asked the questions and they were fine. Something like that for that.
Yeah, the idea of taking your temperature at home is pretty meaningless as far as, you know,
I understand. You can do it there. It does not require where you're. I'm just checking to make sure it doesn't, but I'm pretty sure. Implement mandatory health screening assessment, questionnaire and temperature check for employees, faith leaders, and volunteers. It does not. Responses must be recorded daily. It does not say where and document. It does not say where.
It's no more meaningless than if you have one person at a time in the building. We have a tiny church. We have 3 part-time staff. They come and go individually. Our person in the office usually goes in alone. So whether she takes her temperature at home or takes it in the building, I mean, do we have to have a second person around just to do temperatures every time someone goes in?
You are not, if you are not in the building together, you do not have to do that.
Okay, so it's only when there's going to be another person.
When your building is open. So if you're in the building by yourself and nobody else is coming in, you're not required to have the log. The pastor, for instance, coming in, or the office manager. So in our presbytery, for instance, at our office, we have our director of finance goes in every week to check messages, pick up the mail, etc. Emily is in there, nobody else is in there. She doesn't have to do this because she's there by herself. We're talking about as you move more people into the building, right? Then you need to do this. So
Susan, Lynn Brown,
the office manager, etc.
Lynn Brown has her hand up, has had it up.
Okay, Lynn?
You get your hand up.
Morning, Susan. This has been amazing. I hope that we're going to get to the questions that have been in the chat, or that maybe you'll have an open hour where we can just come and ask you questions, because I have so many. But we have an office that we rent to we have a tenant. He just pays, you know, it's a lease, a psychologist has been essential all along. So we had closed our building, and he was been meeting people, you know, on Zoom and in the parking lot, and one family on an emergency basis. But my understanding has been that because he's been essential, this is all allowed. So now we're trying to move into, like, what do we have to do so that he can reuse his office and see his clients in the building? And
so this doesn't answer that exactly, because this is only, the guides we've been given are for religious services. So technically under New York Forward, all the rest of our building usage will open under phase 4. That will be, if we're lucky to enter phase 3, let's say the last date I heard was June 23rd, that may be sometime in July.
So because he's essential, does that change? So that what I hear you say is that we can't even really entertain a question from our 12-step groups about meeting until phase 4. But if he's been essential all along.
If they're under 10 people, remember, once we hit phase 2, that
Yep.
New York has said gatherings can be 10 people or less in an area as long as they can social distance. So if there are under 10 people, when we hit phase 3, that will change to 25 people.
But then before we open the building, they have their separate entrance. We still have to have the stations and
Yep,
the
all of this has to
sanitizer
be
and
in
all of
place.
that.
Yep, even if you're
Before
letting
we
in
can
10
do that.
people,
Okay.
if you're going to do any of this,
Okay.
this has to be in place.
Okay.
Friends, we
So
are
as
at
far as
the,
the one that's essential, I don't know if anybody else has this, but I mean, can we continue letting him use his office, or I'm confused about the essential part.
For that, I would probably check with your insurance company to make sure they're okay with that.
Okay, thanks.
friends,
Okay,
we are
thanks.
at the 10 o'clock hour, and we usually keep these gatherings to 1 hour. However, if folks are willing and able to stay, we'll give another 30 minutes or so for questions and move in that order, if that is appropriate for everyone. Because there are still a lot of questions I see in the chat. Folks have their hands raised, so we're willing to give another 30 minutes, but we want to honor people's time as well.
So again, maybe this will answer some of the questions in the chat. If you have other groups that would be categorized under religious services in one way or another, so several of you may have other congregations worshiping there, or Buddhist services, or depending how you rent your building, you are the one obligated for making sure that they are following all these steps. You're the one that's got to have, your session has got to make sure of that, because it's your building. Right now, we're talking about guidelines for opening your building. Hopefully, they'll cooperate with it and they're willing to do it, but it's your obligation as we're not landlords, but as the usage person, to make sure that they're following the obligations.
Anne has her hand up, raised. Susan?
Please.
Okay, so my question has to do with session meetings of fewer than 10 people. If they assuming they'll socially distant, do they need to take their temperatures before they come into the building if they're under 10 people?
Yes, so you should be doing the screening. You should have a way for them to enter and exit the building without gathering. Make sure they're parking properly with 6 feet apart from each other.
Okay, thank you.
Donna Fullerton has their hand up.
Donna Fullerton from Ossining. Our AA group amounts to anywhere from, as I've observed their meetings, 8 members present to about 18 or 20. It's not a large group, but they're very, very anxious to begin because alcohol usage has been a big problem during the pandemic. We can limit the meetings to 10, but can they have coffee? Can they bring their own coffee machine?
They can bring their own coffee as long as you have some provisions for disposing of them. Just as you're going to be asking people, if you're going to have disposable masks on a Sunday, for instance, you're going to need a place for them to throw those masks, right? If you end up doing communion, and we'll talk about this more on Thursday, and you're going to have disposable items, you need somewhere for people to throw them so nobody is going around picking up other people's cups. If you can get them to do that, they can bring their own.
They're a very disciplined
You should not have an urn of coffee going, because people have to go over and serve themselves, or a Keurig machine because people have to put the capsule in the machine. You're looking for things that don't have to be touched, right, is what you're aiming for here.
Okay, thank you.
Vicki and Laura from Monroe.
Sorry, had to find the unmute button. Okay, so we have several Al-Anon groups and AA groups that also meet here. So, and some of them can be quite large. Can we have them meet out in our parking lot, provided then they're social distancing, correct?
Yes, as long as you're making it's your obligation to make sure that they're keeping that social distancing.
Okay.
So somebody would need to be there to supervise, to make sure anywhere on your campus these rules apply, that social distancing is in effect, etc. So you need to be the ones to make sure that you're having that enforced. So yes.
Okay, so if they say we get to phase 3 and we can have the 25 people, we have to we have to do all of these other provisions. Do
Yes.
we take their temperatures as they're coming in, and we have to basically.
Remember, attendees, you're to encourage doing that. They can refuse to have their questions asked, their temperature taken. You can only require it of employees, volunteers.
Okay. Anything else?
Friends, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation will be posted to the website, as well as the video of this actual chat. I'm sorry, a recording of this meeting and the chat. Folks keep asking that question. So yes, the PowerPoint presentation will be made available. Will be posted to the website. Thank you. And now we have a question from Marjorie.
Hi, everyone. Susan, my question is about essential services that our building has continued to remain open for. We have a Meals on Wheels program that operates out of our kitchen, and then we also have a food pantry and our free community dinners that we've been doing twice a month. So we have not been requiring these kinds of temperature checks, any of those sorts of things so far. Do we need to do that immediately? And is there anything else we need to change? Because basically we have been, Meals on Wheels, we didn't realize that we were responsible for making sure that they were following the state guidelines. So,
yes,
what do we
so
do differently?
volunteers, for instance, at your meals, whoever the volunteers are that are serving, you should be
nobody's being served on site.
No,
everything has to go.
But you should be screening them. So that the volunteers, the people coming to pick up the food, you don't have to screen. They're not coming into your building, right?
Okay, right, that's correct. They're parking lot pickup.
Volunteers,
but for the Meals
yes.
on Wheels, the volunteers come into the building, they pick up the food, and then they go.
What you're looking for, here's the balance, and if any of the others of you, I put Ellen on the spot, but if there are other lawyers on here, you're all welcome to join on this. What you're looking for is to show that you're not being negligent by not taking the steps you can take. So you're looking to have enough information to say, I properly screened this person, didn't have a temperature, and hadn't been exposed to anyone. So if somebody gets sick, right now, we don't have coverage. You could be sued for negligence. I haven't seen it yet, but the church law and tax, what's the actual thing called? Church and tax law, church law and tax, I can't remember which way it goes, just did an article on how negligence is still a possibility around COVID cases. And so before somebody gets sued, you're looking to show I've done due diligence so there's no negligence, but I don't want so much information that somebody can get a hold of. So you're hitting a balance. Ellen, is that
right? Yeah, I agree and affirm all that you're saying, Susan. And I think it might be helpful for churches to carefully prepare their plan for opening the building, to be able to document that they've done the research, the steps, the thoughtful care of planning and implementing, cleaning, and all that's listed here. And then when you set up these health screening records, to have a check the box form that you can copy, and so that the person's designated to measure those temperatures would just put the name down of the person, and then have a box for temperature okay, check the box, 14-day health window okay, and it would just have it be super easy so that you can make it go fast, and then be consistent. Use that same form every day, every time you have a worship gathering or other people in your building. But it's going to take some thought. It is helpful, though, if you do have those documents in place in the office, so that were there to be a question, you could show that you used your best efforts to comply with some very complicated, new and challenging requirements. Thank you.
Thanks,
Vicky, do you still have another question? You had your hand up. It's no longer up.
No, we kind of changed our mind. Well, yeah, we'll go ahead and ask it. So right now, we technically could have AA meetings or Al-Anon meetings in here, provided they're 10 and under, with all the provisions.
If you have all this plan approved by your session ahead of time.
Okay, so even although it's not like a religious, they're not doing basically church business.
Right, but any business that is opening in any way, so you would be opening, technically you should have the safety plan in effect, is what New York is asking for, and posted each place. So yes, once you have the plan, under 10, fine, as long as you have a way to implement it. I know it sounds daunting, but this is New York trying to make sure everybody who comes into a space is safe.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy, I see you raising your hand. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Could you explain again our responsibility with nesting churches? Do they have to develop their plan? Do we develop their plan? Is our session responsible for making
yes.
sure that they do? Okay.
Yes, you have to have a plan that covers them, that takes them into effect, and they have to have a plan as well. They are a congregation, so they need a plan, but it has to be in keeping with your plan. In the same way that if you have a nursery school, I said this on yesterday's call to nursery school directors and childcare, you need to be talking together because your plans have to work together. People have to enter the building in the way that both plans say. People have to leave the building. So we're talking about really networking and talking with whoever's using your space. This is not just a fill out a card, a form, I'm going to be in here on Mondays and Thursdays. This is now sitting down and having conversations.
And is our session responsible for making sure that they carry out all of these guidelines?
Yes, you own the building.
But we have to be there.
No, you have to figure out some way to make sure that they are carrying out the plans. That could be being there. You could have cameras that make sure they're doing, I don't know, there's lots of different ways.
Jan?
Yes.
It's a very minor question, but I've noticed that there are thermometers now. If you walk into Health Quest right now in Highland, they don't go really near you. They have these thermometers that do take your temperature. You're standing away from them, and they're just, I don't know how expensive these things are, but that may speed things up if you are actually, saying, okay, temperature, it's very quick, and you're not touching anyone.
I was on a call, and I'm guessing these are very expensive, but I was on a call with a group of clergy in which one clergy person said there are instruments that measure a room and temperatures of each person in a room, so you can scan a whole row at once and it reads the temperatures.
Yeah,
they were going to go out and buy that. They thought that would be much faster than one by one.
Sure.
By one.
Susan, I've heard they're about $70, the one-off for the one person.
That's the one person, not the whole room.
Yeah.
If they work well and last.
Like a whole room that will cover 12 feet by 12 feet. You can see each person's temperature in the room. They were going to make clear that, and the question there came up, did they have to tell people they were doing it? And the answer was yes, right? But they were going to do their rooms that way.
Someone has asked the question if the presbytery could buy them in bulk and then sell
get a
them
good
to
deal.
congregation.
Yeah, get a good deal.
I'll turn that over to Deb. She can answer that one. Oh, she can't hear. Nice try.
Maybe we could get a great deal if we buy bulk.
We will. I'm trying to think if anybody from council is on this call. We can bring it up at council. I don't know the answer.
Donna has a question. Donna? Okay, then Stella.
Hi, Susan. Hello, everyone. I'm from White Plains Presbyterian Church. Being basically in the middle of the city of White Plains, we have a lot of visitors coming into our office on a daily basis, are we required to take their temperature or screen them as they come into our building?
Right now, your building shouldn't be open, so nobody
Right.
should be coming in.
Yeah, I know that, but once we open
Once they come in, you are encouraged. You are encouraged that anybody comes on the campus. Are you required? No. They're two different things. So you're not required, you are encouraged, and your session's going to have to decide how you're going to do that. So
Correct.
the ideal would be to say to you, have somebody say, have you been exposed to COVID-19 in the last 14 days? Do you know anybody who, that would be the ideal. But where you're going to draw the line is up to your session.
And someone earlier, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, gave a great suggestion about keeping a log, of course, a piece of paper where everyone can just check off as they come into the building. We have 12-step programs, a lot of them, which they meet after 6, 7 o'clock in the evening. We do have one staff member Monday through Friday, but we can encourage them to give us a log or keep a log of what, the people that they screen once they're in the building, correct? So
that becomes a fine line, because a lot of 12-step programs, people will not want to log that they are in the building.
Right.
And so your session's going to have to conjure with where's the line.
Okay.
And again, I mean, there's no easy answer to a lot of these questions. You're going to do the best you can on meeting the law. The good news is that it says it's mandatory for volunteers and staff. It's encouraged for others. And so how you encourage that has some flexibility for you to think out what will work and what won't.
Thank you, Susan.
Nancy of Yorktown has a question.
Bad times are calling me because they're sewing in the background. Somewhere in everything I read that once we start having, some worship, we're supposed to keep an attendance log, because perhaps, on Tuesday, someone who was fine and had a normal temperature on Sunday starts, exhibits COVID symptoms, and then the contact tracers are going to want that list of attendees, correct?
It's encouraged. That's the ideal. And I have read articles legally both ways, because you also have to follow HIPAA laws. And so they want a record, but you're also supposed to be respecting the person's privacy. And so you're hitting a fine line on what you're putting down. But yes, the encouragement is that you know who was there on Sunday, so you can say, here's who was exposed. But you need to reveal, I want to be clear, you're not going to say, this person was exposed, brought in COVID. That would be a violation of HIPAA laws. You would say you were exposed to somebody who, right, without using names and identifying information.
Friends, with respect to the temperature thermometer devices, Deb will look into it. She can hear everything, but she has no audio. So she will look into that.
And she's exactly right in her comment. We begin to understand why the UCC has decided there will not be in-person worship until 2021, right? Because this is very, very challenging for us each to put into effect. And I want to flag for you again, this is what is in effect as of June 15th. It will change there will be other things added as we have problems. If you look at Kentucky that was ahead of us in going back to worship, do you remember the church in Kentucky that opened and suddenly a huge number of their congregation had COVID afterwards, was exposed and caught COVID? As that happens in New York, things will be put into effect. So Marjorie, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. That actually raises a question for me regarding, and it's probably a polity question, but this is a lot of responsibility to put on sessions that are not necessarily, experts in this. And what I do wonder is if the presbytery, if the council, if the presbytery itself really could offer any particular, you know, I guess it would be recommendations given our polity, but guidance or recommendation regarding what would be sensible for reopening? I mean, many other denominations are doing this exact thing. And I feel like we're sort of all needing to do this on our own, and the inconsistency of it is, it feels chaotic to me, and it feels like a lot of pressure for a lot of people to have to make these decisions. So just sort of wondering, polity-wise, what guidance, what, you know, what can the presbytery or higher than that even offer?
So you have Jay Herbert, who this past weekend put out a statement. He is the stated clerk of the denomination, right? Jay Herbert Nelson, saying, do not rush back into reopening.
Mm-hmm.
There are just so many things to consider, and we have lots of other ways to worship together. So do not, and I put that link to his speech saying that on the guide. That's one of the things I added this weekend. So that's what the denomination is suggesting. Our polity doesn't allow us to say you can't go back to worship, but he has clearly said from a denominational perspective, do not rush back to doing this. This is not something that at this time is easy or wise. And so, and again, I've also want to flag something that's there for you, and I will flag it again on Thursday. I put a link to a blog post from the millennial pastor who has done a post of what it will be like for somebody coming back to your congregation to worship. So they get there, and first they have their temperature taken, and then they're asked questions, and then they have to wait in line, and then they're there, and then there's no singing, and then there's no unison prayer, and the pastor's not allowed to project loudly because that's a problem. So he's talking very quietly up in the front. And then the co-pastor comes up, and she is talking to a camera because the people who are still online are, you should look at it because it suggests why at the moment reopening has a lot of issues to it. It's a blog post worth considering what it really will be like. And if you decide, and again, it's your session, but if you decide you're going to reopen anyway, you need to prepare your congregation. This is the pastor in me speaking, right? Not the lawyer, because it's going to be jarring. People are hungry to get back to what they know and what was comforting to them. That's not what they would be going back to under these criteria. They're closer to what they're used to and what they're seeing if they're seeing a Zoom meeting or a Facebook Live meeting, or then they will be what can be there if they're back in their building. I can't see the name, but I can tell Halsbond.
Oh.
I can't see the first part, sorry.
Can I go ahead? I don't want to, I
Well,
have
first
a
let
question.
me get for Halsbond, and then I'll get Bev.
Sorry, thank you.
You have to unmute.
I was just going to comment on what you just said, that it isn't the same and it hurts, but it's true. When you're doing it online Sundays, you get the singing, you get the, you get the readings, and you get your pastor. It's true in that sense that actually might be more comforting than for some people than what we're saying we have to do in person. So that just wanted to say that when you just said that we don't have to do this if some congregations don't want to.
Right.
Okay.
Now, Bev from Cold Spring. Unmute, please.
Could you review again a little bit about the food pantry? Our food pantry continues to be servicing the community. They distribute the food outside. It's prepackaged now. People no longer choose what they want. But explain to me how the people that are preparing the food should be acting. In other words, we should have this screening set up for them, shouldn't we?
Ideally, you should. Ideally, you should be making sure that you should be asking each of the volunteers who comes in to do the food pantry, have you been exposed to COVID-14 in the last while? Do you have a temperature, etc.? because you don't want somebody handing food to somebody who has a 103-degree temperature. Now, I mean, you know, I trust people who are willing to put themselves doing a food pantry are trying to do it in the best way they can, right? And so they're trying to help people. So probably they don't have a 103 temperature. But again, we know the virus appears before we have symptoms often. And so you do want to ask, have you been exposed to anyone in the last 14 days?
Okay, so we'll have to set that up for our food pantry. I know they use fewer than 10 people in the building, and they have social distancing when they have people come to pick up the food. But, you know, the people who are preparing it, we're going to have to set up those other screening devices. All right, thank you.
Sharon Duncan has a question.
Yes, hello. I'd like to thank you for this presentation. We have a very small congregation, only about 6 active people, and we're all old. Most of us are over 70. Some folks are really pushing to open the church, and we are going to try an outside service in a week or so. I have a husband who has an impaired immune system, and we're trying to be staying away. That puts it down to only about 4 people. It sounds very daunting, and I really am very happy that you made this presentation, and I'm going to share it with my other session members and ask them to look at it. And we'll be praying a lot about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's required, all these steps are required whether you're 6 people or 600 people.
Exactly. That's what's so daunting about it.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, I can't see all the hands. So Izette, I'm looking at you. Are we good?
Mark Pennington has his hand up.
Mark.
In some of the earlier guidance, based on the last comment, there were suggestions that no one over 60 be present in worship until there's a vaccine, if I understood that correctly.
Yes.
So how do we grapple with that requirement, including if we have yoga groups who are all over 60, including the instructors?
So you wouldn't, first of all, you probably wouldn't have a yoga group yet because it's not a worship service.
But later, yeah.
So later by phase 4, when we hit phase 4, my guess is we will be close to a vaccine, or things may shift. I don't think we'll go back to opening up our whole buildings before there's more protocol safety in effect. But right now the answer is for worship, for instance, people who are at risk, whether it's because of age or whether it's because of other health issues, should be discouraged from coming back. All right. The last thing any of us want to do, if we're going to love our neighbors, is to bring somebody into a space where they're going to get sick because of this. So the answer, and we'll talk more about this on Thursday when we talk about worship, but even if you're going back to face-to-face worship, you also should be offering some kind of other worship, what you're offering now, for people who should not be coming back. And it's part of what I loved in that millennial blog, is so you have this poor pastor, and I felt for him as he was writing the blog, who's trying to address a congregation that's in the pews, where half of his congregation is, and trying to address a congregation who's online at the same time. And he can talk to one for part of it and one for another. It's what I'm going to be doing when I teach in the fall, because they're going to be making us do half our class at a time. So that's the dilemma if you open and you have part of your congregation who is in that fragile group in some way. It will be true as well when you go back to activities. How are you going to include those for any activity, be it a Bible study or a yoga group? How are you going to include those who can't be there? Are you going to Zoom yoga? So we know people who are doing that at the moment, right? Are you going to, if you're going to open your yoga studio, is the teacher going to have a camera going so folks who want to participate but can't come into the the chapel for yoga can see it instead.
Friends, we are at the 11:30 hour. We have 2 more questions and then we'll have to wrap this up. So we have Stephen and then Karen. Stephen?
I accidentally put my hand up. You can go ahead.
Karen?
Okay, I'm a little confused about if we can have the NA or the AA, as long as they're less than 10 people, and we have all of our guidelines set. We could also have the mental health professional using his office, which is just one person at a time, correct?
The mental health professional, if you can make sure your screen, again, in both cases, there's a confidentiality issue that you also have to conjure with, right? So
Right.
the mental health professional, if you're opening your building, now are you going to have a log of who that person is? With the 12-step programs, how are you going to, that's your session to grapple with. How are you going to encourage people to do this while keeping the confidentiality that both of those programs require in some way?
But it was just the volunteers and the
who are required.
employers who are required.
So,
So
for instance, your health professional would have to do the checklist each day.
That's what he's doing.
Right.
He's planning to do that.
But you all would have to decide as a session what, for the other groups, what you would be doing.
Right. Okay. But they are allowed. It's just that we have to have it in place.
If they're under 10 at the moment.
Yes. Gotcha. Thank you. And thanks for this. All this information is great.
That's the last question, is that?
That's the last we're going to take. It's 11:33 now.
Okay. So would somebody who's on the call be willing to close us with prayer? I could pick on a pastor, but I think that's probably an unfair thing to do. So who would like to?
Ed Carlson.
Okay, Ed, please.
Gracious God, we have come together to try to do your will for your churches in this presbytery. We ask that you would continue to bless us, watch over us, encourage us, and allow us to do that will, not only for ourselves, but for the people you have given to us to be part of your greater congregation. Help us now and always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ed. All right, friends. So those of you who want to look at worship, we will be doing that on Thursday at the same time. You should have